Welcome to a deep dive. We grab the sources, find the crucial insights, and lay them out just for you. Today, we're heading to Papua New Guinea and the islands nearby. It's a place with, well, just incredible history and complexity. We're looking at some really fascinating new research, especially a study in nature ecology and evolution, using ancient DNA to shed light on the human story there over the last few thousand years.
Exactly. This region, Near Oceania, it's been central to some huge moments in human history. I mean, settled super early, over 50,000 years ago. And it was this vital launch pad for settling the rest of the Pacific, remote Oceania, some of the very last places people reached.
So our mission here is to explore how combining that ancient DNA with archaeology, linguistics, all these clues, is kind of rewriting the story of the people on the coasts of PNG and the Bismarck Archipelago. And get ready, because the genetic picture is, well, it's way more complex and surprising than we might have thought. Lots of interaction, migration, resilience.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit more. As you said, New Guinea, the islands around it settled really, really early. We're talking 50,000 years before present. And just a quick note, before present usually means before 1950 in archaeological terms. So, deep time. These first people laid the groundwork for the amazing diversity you see today. Hundreds and hundreds of languages, mostly grouped under the Papuan label, reflecting those ancient roots.
And you really see that today, right? Over 800 languages just in PNG. But then much, much later, something else happened. A new wave.
Precisely. Around 3,000 years ago, you get the emergence of what we call the Lapita Cultural Complex. Its heartland was the Bismarck Archipelago, those islands just northeast of New Guinea. Archaeologically, we know Lapita mainly from this really distinctive pottery, with intricate stamped designs. Very beautiful stuff.
But they weren't just potters, were they? The sources paint them as incredibly adaptable people.
Oh, yeah. Skilled farmers. They had pigs, chickens. They were amazing long-distance sailors in these big canoes, and great foragers, too, on land and sea. And their voyages, I mean, they went far, thousands of miles east. They settled places like Vanuatu, Tonga, even Samoa, taking that culture with them.
Right. But the genetic story of these Lapita pioneers back in the Bismarcks, that's been a bit hazy, hasn't it?
It has. We knew they were there from the archaeology, obviously,
Right.
But figuring out their direct genetic legacy right there at the starting point has been tricky, until this new study, really.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting, especially with Wadham Island. It's in the Bismarcks, and it's already famous because, well, that's where the first Lapita pottery was ever identified, like over a century ago.
That's the place. So naturally, you'd kind of expect it to be a major Lapita genetic center.
You would, but the big surprise in the study was finding ancient people on Wadham whose genes were, well, completely Papuan, 100%.
Right. And the crucial part is they lived after the Lapita cultural stuff, the pottery, shows up in the archaeological record on that same island.
Wow. So you've got Lapita culture present, but you also have people there whose genetics trace back to those much older Papuan roots, maybe living side by side. How does the timeline break down genetically on Wadham in the study?
Okay, so the older individuals they sampled, dating from roughly 3,800 back to 3,300 years ago, and then another group from about 2,700 to 2,100 years ago, they all showed exclusively Papuan ancestry. No trace of that East Asian-related ancestry we usually link with the Lapita migrations, not in the genes found on Wadham from that time. It's only later, with an individual dated around 2,000 to 1,600 years ago. Maybe 1,900 years ago is the midpoint that you see a clear mix.
Right.
Both Papuan and that East Asian-related ancestry together. And then those recent ones, maybe 700 to 500 years ago, they look genetically similar to people in the area today, but, not necessarily direct exclusive ancestors. It's complex.
Okay, so the key thing is this delay. You have people with different genetic origins, likely on the same small island, maybe for hundreds of years, but significant genetic mixing seems to have waited. That feels unexpected.
It really does. It's quite unusual. And this finding, this sort of protracted coexistence with limited mixing early on, followed by later integration, it actually gives strong support to a specific idea about how remote Oceania was settled.
How so?
It suggests that those very first canoes heading way out east to Tonga, Samoa, places like that, they were likely carrying people who were predominantly Lapita associated with that East Asian-related ancestry. There probably wasn't much Papuan genetic ancestry mixed in before they left the Bismarcks. It seems the mixing with people carrying Papuan ancestry happened later, after populations were established out on those remote islands, possibly through subsequent migrations from Near Oceania.
So the initial Lapita pulse into the remote Pacific was perhaps less genetically mixed than some models assumed.
That seems to be what the Wadham evidence points towards, yeah.
And the bioarchaeology from Wadham adds more layers to this picture of different groups coexisting, doesn't it?
Absolutely fascinating details.
Sure.
Like, they looked at strontium isotopes in the teeth and bones. It's like a chemical signature of where you grew up.
Yeah.
And all the individuals they sampled on Wadham looked local. Their isotope ratios matched the island's geology, or some were very close by with similar geology. So these weren't newcomers who'd just arrived from far away.
Okay, so they were locals. And what about that individual with the pure Papuan ancestry? The one from maybe 2,500 years ago, they had some distinctive cultural practices.
Yes, that individual from that roughly 2,700, 2,100 year period, the one with only Papuan ancestry, they showed evidence of cultural cranial modification, shaping the skull during childhood. Now, that's not something we typically see in Lapita burials, but it is known from other groups in the wider region, historically. Plus, this person was buried in a unique seated position. So you combine the genetics, the skull shaping, the burial style. It really paints a picture of culturally distinct groups living on Wadham at the same time.
Wow. And diet. Anything there?
Yeah, they looked at dental calculus, hardened plaque on the teeth. They found microparticles suggesting arboriculture. Cultivating tree crops was important. Another piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so Wadham gives us this picture of, well, complex coexistence and delayed mixing in the Bismarcks. Let's shift now to the mainland, the south coast of Papua New Guinea. The study looked at two sites there, Nabira 2 and Ariama. Geographically, really close, right? And the individuals date from the last, say, 500 years or so up to the present.
Okay, yeah, the south coast. So here, the story is a bit different. Not so much about delayed mixing, but about divergence. What's striking here is that even though these two sites, Nabira 2 and Ariama, are practically neighbors, their genetic ancestry started to diverge quite significantly around 650 years ago.
That seems odd. You'd think being close would mean more mixing, more similarity over time, not becoming more different.
Exactly. It's counterintuitive. So why would these nearby communities start heading down different genetic paths?
What's the thinking?
Well, the researchers suggest it points to them becoming part of different interaction spheres, basically different social networks, maybe different trade partnerships, different cultural influences, even though they live close together physically. And the genetics really back this up.
How did the DNA differ between Nabira 2 and Ariama?
So the Nabira 2 individuals, they were genetically more homogeneous. People within that community were, on average, more closely related to each other. They also had a higher amount of that East Asian-related ancestry, something like 45% to 60%. And the estimated time when that mixing first happened in their ancestors past the admixture date was older, clustering around 1,500 years ago.
Okay, so more East Asian ancestry, and the mixing happened further back in time at Nabira 2. What about Ariama?
Ariama was different. Individuals there had higher proportions of Papuan-related ancestry, maybe averaging around 80%, but there was more variation between individuals. Their main admixture dates were generally younger, maybe around 1,100 years ago on average. But then, interestingly, some Ariama individuals show signs of more recent mixing, getting additional East Asian-related ancestry within the last 600, 400 years, bringing their total up to maybe 35% in those cases.
So a more varied, perhaps more dynamic genetic history at Ariama compared to the more uniform picture at Nabira 2.
Exactly. More variable ancestry proportions and multiple more recent time points for mixing in Ariama.
And you mentioned this divergence started around 650 years ago. Does that timing connect to anything known from archaeology in the region?
It does, yeah. It lines up pretty well with a period archaeologists sometimes call the Papuan hiccup or the ceramic hiccup. Roughly 1,200 down to 500 years ago, it seems to be a time of, well, disruption and change. We see shifts in settlement patterns, maybe sites being abandoned, people relocating. Long-distance trade networks seem to break down or reconfigure, and pottery styles become less widespread, more localized.
So this genetic split between neighbors happens right around the time things seem to be getting reorganized, maybe more fragmented, archaeologically speaking. What could have driven that hiccup?
It was likely a mix of factors. The sources mention environmental stress, think climate change, like the medieval climate anomaly, and maybe more intense El Niño events, causing droughts. That could have really impacted farming, made some areas less viable, pushed people to move or reorganize.
And defense might have become more important.
Seems likely. The fact that some sites from this period, like Nabira 2 itself, are on these defensive hilltop locations, well, it suggests relationships between groups might have been changing, maybe becoming more tense. Potential conflict could be a factor driving people to defensible spots and perhaps reinforcing group boundaries.
And this ancient pattern of nearby but distinct groups on the south coast, it echoes what we see today, doesn't it?
It really does. It feels very relevant to the modern linguistic and cultural landscape there. You have the coastal Motu people who speak an Austronesian language, living near the more inland Koita people who speak a Papuan language. Historically, these groups had really close ties. They intermarried. They traded. The famous Irie trading voyages involved interactions like these. So this ancient DNA evidence suggests these complex patterns of interaction, but also maintaining distinct identities, have really deep roots in the region.
Fascinating. And the bioarchaeology from Nibiru and Ariama adds even more detail.
Yeah, a few more interesting points. Isotope analysis at Nibiru suggested that while most people buried there were local, a few individuals had signatures indicating they grew up elsewhere, maybe nearer the coast, with different diets. So some mobility into Nibiru. And they also look at genetics for clues about population history, using something called runs of homozygosity, basically long stretches of identical DNA inherited from both parents. The pattern suggested Nibiru, too, had a larger effective population size than Ariama, which might hint at Nibiru being part of a larger breeding network or having a different community structure compared to the seemingly smaller, maybe more isolated Ariama community at times.
And burial practices differed, too.
Right. Nibiru, too, had primary burials burying the body whole. Ariama primarily used secondary cave burials where bones might be moved or reinterred later. Again, reinforcing the idea of distinct cultural practices despite the proximity.
Okay, so that covers the Bismarcks and the South Coast. But the study also had a connection to somewhere much further away.
Yeah, just one individual's genome. But it provided a really cool piece of data relevant to the settlement of the Mariana Islands, places like Guam and Saipan, way up north in Micronesia.
What was the connection?
Well, when they analyzed this genome alongside others from the Marianas, the modeling suggested that the ancestors of the Mariana Islanders likely came from island Southeast Asia, think maybe the Philippines or Taiwan region, rather than coming from islands much closer, like those northeast of New Guinea.
And why is that route significant? Island Southeast Asia to the Marianas.
Because getting there from island Southeast Asia would have meant sailing against the prevailing winds and currents for at least part of the journey. It wasn't the easiest route. So it really highlights just how incredibly skilled these early Austronesian navigators were. They had the technology and the knowledge to tackle challenging voyages, even against the elements, to settle northwestern remote Oceania. Pretty amazing.
This whole study really drives home the point about needing different kinds of evidence to build the picture, doesn't it? It's not just genetics.
Oh, absolutely. You couldn't get this level of detail from just one discipline. You need the ancient DNA, obviously, to see the ancestry, the mixing, the relationships. But then you need the archaeology. The pottery tells you about culture and connections. The sites tell you about settlement choices. The burials tell you about beliefs and practices.
Right.
And the bioarchaeology adds more isotopes, tell you about where people lived and maybe what they ate. The dental calculus gives dietary clues. And then bringing in linguistics, oral traditions, it helps connect the ancient past to the people living today.
It's like assembling a really complex jigsaw puzzle. Each piece, genetics, artifacts, bones, language, gives you a vital part of the image.
Exactly that. It's this interdisciplinary approach that lets us build a much richer, more nuanced story about how people moved, interacted, adapted, how they shaped history in this incredibly dynamic part of the world.
So, wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway here? This deep dive seems to show a human past in PNG and the Pacific that's far more complex than maybe some older, simpler models suggested.
I think that's right. We've seen evidence for, well, really different scenarios playing out. On Wadham, you have distinct groups seemingly living alongside each other for a long time before major genetic mixing occurred. That's surprising. Then on the South Coast, you have nearby communities actually diverging genetically, probably influenced by things like climate shifts, trade disruptions, changing social landscapes. And woven through it all are these incredible stories of seafaring and connection across vast distances.
It really underscores that human history isn't just one simple story of migration leads to instant mixing. It's much messier, much more varied. Sometimes people maintain distinct identities for centuries, even as neighbors. Other times, external pressures or internal dynamics cause splits. It's fascinatingly complex.
And understanding these ancient patterns definitely refines how we think about human expansion, adaptation, and interaction in this absolutely crucial region of the world.
So here's something to think about. We see this deep history playing out, groups interacting, sometimes mixing, sometimes staying distinct, sometimes diverging. How do you think those ancient layers, those complex histories we've talked about, contribute to the absolutely staggering cultural and linguistic diversity that defines Papua New Guinea and the Pacific even today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? connecting that deep past to the vibrant, complex present.
Definitely something to ponder. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the ancient history of Papua New Guinea.